Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and welcome to another episode of Thinking and Feeling Libertarian. Okay, in this one, what I want to do is talk about Donald Trump and immunity. And again, I'm going to make this episode also an episode of my opinion podcast, because I will probably express my opinion towards the end. I'll start off by just sort of explaining what happened with Donald Trump in the Supreme Court. I'm not going to get into all the details of the nature of the court case, whatnot. What I'm going to focus on is the implications of the ruling. Okay, essentially what the ruling said is that essentially put actions by a president in sort of three categories. So there's like official acts. So basically, if you are a president and you are carrying out your actual scope of duties, which technically are what's detailed in the Constitution, although again, what the Constitution sort of authorizes has become a white hole. Again, you can argue, hey, what does it actually mean? And, be a strict constitutionalist. And I'm sympathetic to that. But at the end of the day, sort of like current jurisprudence, the current way courts work, whatnot, what the president theoretically can do, has authority to do, is quite wide. Whether that is right, intended, wrong, etc., the reality is the president's powers have expanded quite a bit over the years. So the idea is that if you are the president and you are doing something within the bounds of sort of what you're supposed to be doing, so what is within your job description, so you are acting as so for example, let's say you make some really bad decision as far as what the military should do, okay? Should you be judged as a criminal for it? So in this case, really, like, one of the biggest things is that, like, if a president wages war, they cannot be held criminally liable for those acts. That's going to be sort of a very clear line. So basically, if I say, hey, I order the military to go invade Mexico, okay, people can think, whatever, they can't do it. Now, again, you can argue that, hey, technically the president doesn't have the power to just invade a country. They would have to get a declaration of war constitutionally. But again, if we've taken a look at the way the president has operated, that hasn't really been the case for quite a while, where a president can just they won't call it war. They'll just say, hey, we're conducting kinetic military action or something. So it's a little scary when you think of actual official actions. Now, most people are thinking about it in terms of Trump. So in a sense, like, Trump, not the most ethical of people, okay? Not necessarily against the idea of using whatever levers for his own advantage, okay? So people are like, oh, well, this gives Donald Trump a blank slate. It does and it doesn't. Okay, so again, there's official acts. Then there's sort of acts that you may be doing under the pretense of being official, but are really kind of outside the bounds. So like you're saying you're acting as president, but this is really not something you should be doing. Okay, and then it's like, basically they have presumptive immunity, which I take extra issue with this, in the sense that basically the idea is that we're going to assume that you can't be, and again, all of this is specifically referring to criminal liability, so meaning whether a district attorney, the Justice Department, whether they can take charges. Okay, because again, there's civil and criminal liabilities, meaning one, can just some other random person sue me for damages? That's civil liability. Then there's criminal liability, like can I be charged with a crime, sent to jail, etc. Okay, so those are the two liabilities. So basically, they're really saying you can't send the president to jail. And then the third category is non-official acts. So if Trump just went stabbed somebody while he was president, okay, that would not be immune. He can go to jail for murder for that. But if he were to order, and again, these are referred to as sort of like what's called, and it's not even the most ridiculous scenarios, but scenarios that are sort of reductio absurdums. And I'm not a huge fan of reductio absurdums, just because if you think of sort of like the most absurd scenario for a situation, like the most absurd possibility, that in itself isn't sort of like a sufficient argument against something. Like, it can illustrate how bad something could possibly be, but again, the most extreme situation isn't likely what's going to happen. So saying, hey, we should not do X because of the most ridiculous possible scenario isn't always helpful. Okay, but I do think we have seen the president order drone killings of U.S. citizens. This has happened in the past, and it has happened under the guise of the fight against terrorism. Okay, now it hasn't happened on U.S. soil, but you can kind of see an argument where basically you make the right case, especially like when you have situations like today, where basically you have times where domestic U.S. groups are labeled as terrorist groups, whether you think they should or shouldn't. Then you can kind of imagine that, hey, look, a drone strike on X group is something that can be considered and then you always see this with the right and the left. So like, when the left's in power, they're labeling sort of different sort of extreme right-wing groups as terrorists, while when the right's in power, they're labeling the farthest left, sort of commie kind of groups in that category. So you could theoretically then say, hey, you know what, if I were to drone that group, I'm acting within my presidential powers and I have no criminal liability for it. Now, again, this is extreme because technically, like, one, it was already really hard to try presidents for a lot of their actions officially, and they were already civilly immune. So that means you couldn't personally sue the president because it's something that happened to you from a decision they made. And this is a typical practice. Like, again, this is not necessarily outside the norm. This is something you see pretty much like within pretty much all government employees, within the medical field, within the legal field, maybe not so much the medical field, certain aspects of the medical field. But what it's referred to is qualified immunity. So the idea is that, hey, like, you know what? For example, there's something called judicial immunity. And the concept here is that, if judges think they can get personally sued because of a decision they made as a judge, then they're going to be scared to make decisions because they're scared of or even scared to become a judge in the first place. So you won't be you won't have enough judges, or judges won't do the right thing because they're too scared of getting sued afterwards. So in that case, they're civilly immune from being sued for the specific things that they heard. I don't think judges and cops and whatnot are criminally immune. Cops are a different story because, again, a lot of the actions they can take can easily fall into criminal charges. And you've seen that kind of immunity play out in a lot of these sort of like cop, interactions with cops that resulted in sort of, deaths. So again, this is not necessarily like unique to the president. It's not like the president's getting sort of special arrangement that isn't available to a lot of government employees. So in the sense of what you see at other levels of government, I don't think the decision is necessarily outside the norm as people realize. The difference is like the president's quite powerful, a figure, especially nowadays. And two, whether this whole doctrine of immunity makes sense in the first place. Like, at the end of the day, like, I'm a free market libertarian. So to me, there's generally a market answer. Like, at the end of the day, like, you take a look at what happens with, and I don't know, a lot of people are not going to like this example, and it gets into some deeper issues, but you think of what happens with, like, doctors. Okay, so doctors can get sued. They do get sued a lot, so they have to buy malpractice insurance. So the cost of litigation gets priced in insurance. Okay, like, doctors get sued all the time. It's not the end of the world. It just ends up being reflected in their malpractice insurance, which then gets reflected in their prices. That's the high price of healthcare. Now, again, as far as, like, again, people talk about like frivolous cases and whatnot, I do think some of that can be mitigated through like court reforms. And there's like, there's no sort of like, libertarian playbook for how a court should be run or how the court system should work. In the most extreme sort of libertarian version, you would have even a market for different courts, and different courts would try different things, and you'd see what works best. But I do think something like, let's say, like a loser pays, which they have in Europe, where basically, hey, if you sue somebody and you lose, you're responsible for the legal costs for both parties, would discourage a lot of frivolous law cases because people wouldn't take them on if they didn't think they could handle the result of losing. Okay, this also discourages people from cases that are just, that, maybe they are legally outpowered, but at the end of the day, like, it helps minimize some of the external cost pressures. So again, there's no trade-off free option. Cool. So again, not saying that's like ideal or not, just saying that like that's a possible way you mitigate it. But again, so imagine this. Imagine that if you're the president, if you are a judge, if you are whatnot, you do have to buy insurance for civil liabilities, okay? But what happened is that basically the kinds of decisions they make and the kinds of things they can get sued for would get priced in by insurance companies. And this also means insurance companies would have to do research to quantify these risks, would actually provide more information about sort of like, hey, what is proper and what's not proper, and be able to provide guidance to presidents on sort of how to make decision making, because again, they would have a huge vested interest in making sure that the president has that kind of guidance to navigate those legal waters. Now, when it comes to criminal penalties, okay, again, criminal penalties. So here's where the issue gets complicated with criminal penalties, because that oftentimes, like, there's more crimes than there is people to prosecute them, right? Okay, so DAs, judges, whatnot, they all have a lot of discretion as far as, hey, like, which crimes are we going to pursue, which cases are we going to hear out, and when we're going to hear them out, and whatnot. And that discretion can oftentimes come from their personal opinions, their personal incentives, and this is where sort of we get into this issue. So, for example, you hear libertarians talk about sort of injustice in the justice system all the time, where basically, like a lot of times, DAs will over prosecute, so they'll put on more charges than are really necessary for a particular case, so that way they can look more tough on crime for when they want to run for political office. They'll target people who are poor, who are less likely to be able to afford the type of legal support to actually be able to put up a fight in court. Basically push them to settle, and even if they're innocent, or basically overcharge them to encourage them to settle for less charges. Like, there's all sorts of these different tactics that are used, and disparities that occur within the justice system because of incentives and whatnot. But again, a lot of these people are sometimes appointed. So again, you can imagine a situation where someone comes into office and they leverage this happens. They leverage the legal system against their enemies. So they sit there and say, okay, well, they go to the DA and say, hey, I'm going to appoint you as X position if you make sure that you put. And again, these are things that are not done explicitly, so you're not going to be able to sit there and say, well, when has this happened? A lot of this stuff happens quid pro quo behind the scenes, but this visibly happens. We'll say, hey, you know what, go investigate or go bring up some charges against an enemy of mine. Even if it doesn't, if you end up dropping the charges later, this can cause issues for them, whether it's the legal costs in the short run or damage to their reputation, things like that. And people can use, bad people with political power can then use the justice system to their advantage to do some pretty punishing things. Then there is, so in that case, that's the reason why this the idea of criminal immunity, because the idea is like, okay, hey, do you necessarily want, since the criminal system is oftentimes is political, okay, like it or not, justice isn't just, it's a system that is there because something has to be there, but it's far from being this sort of impartial, fair system. And in that case, where basically the people who control the levers of the system tend to be political actors, you don't want them to just sit there and be lost and just sort of using it against each other. And that's sort of the thought process behind this sort of criminal immunity, being like, okay, well, people can't be using like every excuse, even though they do anyways. Like, every president has been impeached, or has had impeachment charges brought. Not everyone has had successfully been impeached, just Trump. But every Congress has brought up impeachment charges on every president in charge and investigated every president in charge. Like, nowadays, political vindictiveness is just the norm. Like, it's assumed, which is unfortunate. Okay, it's not like, okay, hey, let's fight on our differences in policy and bring it to the people. It's, okay, let me investigate you to make it look like something is going on constantly. Okay, just this, and then over this basically constant posturing among both parties. So I can get that. But it doesn't sit well with me, the idea that people can just sort of not have to face consequences, and it's people only in specific positions, oftentimes in government positions, who get this kind of immunity, while the rest of the people who also have to suffer the consequences of their decisions and who also have these sort of the same considerations, don't get this. It's a privilege of being in the public sector, which doesn't sit well with me. Now again, do I imagine a world where everyone should be buying malpractice insurance, and would that necessarily be a wonderful world either? No. I mean, that might be a theoretically better in the long run, but again, there are different issues with the American judicial system and sort of the litigiousness of the U.S. society currently that makes that kind of harder to sort of stomach. The fact that everyone kind of rushes to each other, and that's oftentimes because of economic policy. So a lot of people are struggling, and that causes people to try to find other ways to make money and scam each other. Versus if you had like a better economy, better education, if you fix a lot of those foundational things, and people were just sort of better off by default because the education system isn't screwed up and the economy isn't screwed up through tax and regulatory burdens, you might have a situation where you can kind of see this in other richer countries where and again per capita, because on an absolute nature the US is pretty rich, as rich as you get, where you see better outcomes. And again, it's not outcomes because like regulatory and tax policy is better, but it's because like just sort of like that the average foundation that the average person has is a little bit better in the sense of like education mostly, and then usually that opens up economic opportunity. So the fact that there might be less lower end economic opportunity in a lot of places becomes less of an issue. But again, there's there's trade-offs to everything. So all sort of conversations. But with that, I'll leave it at that. Hopefully this helps you understand the nature of this better. Overall, I'm not thrilled with this particular Supreme Court decision. I do think some of the Supreme Court decisions they've made recently that limit the regulatory state are good. Okay. Because they decrease the power of the president. I'm not a fan of this one because it increases the power of the president. And particularly, it looks like Donald Trump probably is likely to become president. And I just do find him to be someone who, if he could abuse his power, would abuse his power. That's the reason why he's in a lot of these court cases. Now, again, are a lot of these abuses as egregious as the Democrats try to make them out to be? Probably in an absolute way, like in a sense, like how much, some maybe, but most of them I think probably are overstated, and two, like again, probably a lot of it's going to be for like his own financial benefit, more like if you looking at sort of Trump's just sort of general persona. So I again think it's overstated, but again, if there was someone who was sort of like the person you don't want having this kind of precedent set with while they're president, it's Trump. Again, whether you like him or not, it's he's not the kind of person that I would want to work with on the honor system. Okay, so yeah. I'm not saying that I like. Again, I'm a libertarian, so I generally like all presidents, and most public sector actors are going to be ones that I just have issue with sort of the culture of it, more so than I have any personal issues with anyone in personal. Like I think people make a lot of this stuff way too personal, but it's just the nature, sort of the incentives and the structure and the institutional, the current institutional structure just does not lend itself to the kind of governance people would think is good. So I'll leave it at that. I'll see y'all later. Have a great day.